Greetings. Thank you for being at our NTI Conversation series. Today, I think we have the privilege of a conversation of the difference. So I'd like to first begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we reside, the Woli people of the Dharawal Nation. And to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and future. I would also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which you all belong. Working in a center of humanistic Buddhism that is informed by Buddhist wisdom, I'd like to also recognize the triple gem of the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. Together, they make up the lineage, philosophy, and community of Buddhism that we at the Humanistic Buddhism Center embrace to deepen our engagement, reflection, and scholarly investigation. Today's NTI conversation is about Buddhism changing the world. Just yes, that's right. We would like to explore how diplomacy, AI, and the role of thought shapes contemporary global challenges. It will be presented by my two esteemed scholars sitting next to me, Associate Professor Jack Chia, as well as Professor Stefania Travagnin. And they came all the way here from Australia, first from Singapore, my hometown, and also from the UK, from Europe. So far, it's like a totally different hemisphere and different time zone, but I'm grateful that we're all now sitting together in this space. So today's topic is going to be divided into two parts. We've got a section on diplomacy and a section on AI. And I know there's going to be lots taking place, so I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Jack to start us off. So I guess you would like to share screen?
Yes. Share my slides and to share.
And you
Is it? All right. Okay. So thank you so much, Venerable Juewei, for the very generous invitation to share my research. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank the organizers for putting together the wonderful symposium, which launched the English translation of the land transmission record of Venerable Master Xing Yun. And also, I'm very glad to see Venerable Miao Guang and also friends and colleagues in the room today. So today I will be giving a talk on Buddhist diplomacy, and I have been working on Buddhist diplomacy over the last 5 years as part of this project that was supported by the Singapore Social Science Research Council, or SSRC. And I just published an edited volume, Figures of Buddhist Diplomacy. Thank you. Beautiful. And which just came out in February this year, and it's a fully open access. So if you are interested, please feel free to scan the QR code, or you can just Google it online and you can download a copy of the book. So this Figures of Buddhist Diplomacy is a kind of collaborative project with scholars from different parts of the world, including Asia, Europe, and North America. And we have put together a volume that examines 22 prominent figures that contributed to various different aspects of Buddhist diplomacy. So we have figures such as Master Tai Shi, Master Nichidatsu Fuji, and as well as important lay leaders, for instance, such as like Zhao Puzhu, and of course well-known Buddhist masters in the contemporary era, including like, for instance, the 14th Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, and of course Venerable Master Xing Yun. And also the volume also explores the role of politicians and royalty that were involved in Buddhist diplomacy, and some of them are still very much active in Buddhist diplomacy, and which I will soon talk about, including, like, for instance, the Prime Minister of India, Modi, as well as the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. So I'm going to talk more about that later on. So when I launched the volume in April this year, I was honored to have Professor Chan Heng Chu, who is the ambassador at large at Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the former ambassador to the United States, as my guest of honor. And Professor Chan, she's a renowned scholar, but also a very eminent diplomat. But very interestingly, she also shared with me that she is a Catholic. But she told me that Vatican diplomacy is pretty much something that scholars of Catholicism have look at and talk about very much, because Vatican is also a state, and how the role of the Pope is also like the head of state. So scholars who have looked at Christianity have studied the role of Vatican and of course Vatican diplomacy. So she was surprised to know that Buddhists have engaged in Buddhist diplomacy, but more importantly, how Buddhist leaders as well as politicians have relied on Buddhism as a platform for peace building, but also as a kind of channel for collaboration and conversation. So this is something that we have this conversation about the role of Buddhist diplomacy in the contemporary world. So my lecture today will be divided into 4 parts. First, I will start with a quick overview of, I will introduce this term or concept of Buddhist diplomacy. Second, I will talk about Buddhist diplomacy in Republican China and the post-war era. And this is something that I hope to share a bit more about how we can think about the role of Buddhism, especially in the context of Chinese Buddhism, because we know that many of you in the audience are working on humanistic Buddhism, and of course Chinese Buddhism and humanistic Buddhism are very much intertwined, right? So I something I hope to share. And the third part of my lecture, I will talk about Buddhist diplomacy in post-Mao China, especially with the Buddhist revival in the post-cultural revolution period. How did Chinese Buddhists engage in Buddhist diplomacy, and how Buddhist diplomacy play a role in facilitating the kind of communication, but also networks among Buddhist communities across Asia? And finally, not so much about diplomacy, but about cross-strait relations. I will talk about Buddhism in cross-strait relations, and also I will talk about Venerable Master Xing Yun's role in cross-strait relations. And I hope to close today's talk with a question, right? How can we think about the relations between Buddhist diplomacy and humanistic Buddhism? So with that, I will start with definition. What exactly is Buddhist diplomacy? And I love this AI generated image. Buddhist diplomacy, we don't win wars, we serve tea and lower everyone's blood pressure. Right? So, to think about that in the context of Buddhist diplomacy is how Buddhism can be a platform of peace and conversation. And this is how I define Buddhist diplomacy in my book, that how by Buddhist diplomacy I refer to the use of Buddhism as a cultural, but also as a political instrument, encompassing the strategic deployment of Buddhist symbols, objects, but more importantly, not only by Buddhists, but also non-Buddhists and even state actors to advance both formal and informal state objectives. So in other words, we can see many interesting figures engaging in Buddhist diplomacy, and sometimes they are not even Buddhists, talking about Buddhism and working with Buddhists, right, to bring about peace and conversations in modern Asia. So let me start by thinking about, by going into this conceptual discussion about what diplomacy is about, right? So in fact, Buddhist diplomacy is not something new at all. It's not a new phenomenon. In fact, Buddhists have even considered the Buddha himself as an early diplomat of peace. And one very good example that Buddhists often talk about is how the Buddha himself intervened to resolve tension between neighboring kingdoms, right? Especially between the Sakyas and the Koliyas. And of course, the Sakyas and the Koliyas in history, they are competition and conflict over water resources, and how the Buddha actually was pretty much like a kind of ambassador of peace, right? Trying to bring kind of conversations and peace between different kingdoms in ancient India. But if we look at the Buddhism in both medieval China and of course in the earlier period in the first millennium, and of course we can actually look at the role of Buddhist diplomacy across different empires. And one good example will be, for instance, Professor Tan Sen Sen's very important book, right, that you see on the slide, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, which is where he looked at the important role of Buddhism in Sino-Indian kind of cultural interaction as early as during the Tang period. And more recently, my advisor, Professor M. Blackburn, who's a leading scholar in Theravada Buddhism, has looked at the role of Theravada Buddhism in Buddhist diplomacy across the Indian Ocean. And in her recent book, Buddhist inflected sovereignties across the Indian Ocean, she talks about how the creation of a kind of Pali arena brought about Buddhist diplomacy and cultural exchanges across the Theravada Buddhist kingdoms in the Indian Ocean. So in other words, Buddhist diplomacy is not something that's new. It has happened for a long time. But in the 20th century to the present, we see actually Buddhist diplomacy at work. And this is something that I hope to share a bit more about today. So when we move forward to the 20th century, then we see Buddhist diplomacy was used in various ways, in fact, during the Cold War. And one good example would be, in fact, in this very important book by Holmes Welch, which actually needs no introduction. Holmes Welch published a wonderful book, in fact, 3 wonderful books about Buddhism in modern China. And of course, in his very important book, Buddhism Under Mao, Holmes Welch argues that the Communist Party of China actually utilized Buddhism to foster cultural exchanges and religious ties with Buddhist majority neighboring countries, both in East but also South and Southeast Asia, during the early years of the establishment of the PRC, which is something that not many people are aware of. In fact, many people thought that after the establishment of the PRC in 1949, that Mao Zedong was just very hostile to religion and there was no such religious interaction. And in fact, it is not true. In fact, there was vibrant Buddhist interactions and exchanges from the 50s to the 60s before the Cultural Revolution. And this and Holmes Welch's book really tells us about the kind of connections that were happening in the early years of the PRC. And at the same time, it's also interesting to see that during this period in the 50s and early 60s, Chinese and Japanese Buddhists actually drew upon Buddhism as a shared cultural heritage to rebuild diplomatic relations after the Sino-Japanese War. And I'm going to talk more about the important figures that were engaging in this peace-building conversation after the war. And in fact, it's also interesting that during the Cold War, the United States was actually supporting Buddhist individuals to counter communist influence during the Cold War. And in fact, often through NGOs such as the Asian Foundation to sponsor Buddhist organizations. So it's very interesting. And this is what in a recent book by Eugene Ford, Cold War Monks, talk about the role of the Asia Foundation in sponsoring Buddhism during the Cold War. So we see Buddhist diplomacy at play. So in other words, we see that how Buddhism continues to be a very important instrument and platform for both diplomatic, but also soft power strategy, but also how in recent years, we see how India, which is the homeland of the Buddha, has been actively using Buddhism as a soft power tool, not only for diplomacy under Prime Minister Modi, but also as an attraction to promote tourism, especially pilgrimage tourism in India. At the same time, we see how China positions itself at the center of Mahayana civilization, at the center for Chinese Buddhism, and of course sponsored Belt and Road Initiative, but also to court Buddhist leaders and communities, especially under Xi Jinping's presidency, right? So I'm going to look at that later on. So yeah, we see Buddhism as a very important soft power resource in the region. So let me start with, let's go back to Republican China. And of course, we have a few important masters who were engaging in Buddhist diplomacy at the time. One of them was Master Yuan Ying, who was a very prominent Buddhist teacher and reformer, and he played a role in Buddhist diplomacy during the early years of the Sino-Japanese War. So in fact, the Kuomintang government at that time sponsored a Venerable Yuan Ying's proposal to not only travel abroad to fundraise for China's war effort. He also mobilized Buddhist networks in Singapore and Malaya to support China. And in fact, he was such a prominent teacher in Malaya. So in fact, he had a big following in Penang, so much so that he was invited to be the abbot of the Ket Lok Monastery, the Jile Shi in Penang. So he had a very popular kind of support. Of course, besides that, other than he raised moral, financial, material assistance for the wartime relief, he also actually relied on Buddhist diplomacy as a platform for anti-Japanese resistance. So he actually saw that as a way to actually gain support for China's cause during the Sino-Japanese War. And besides Master Yuan Ying, there was another very prominent master that was actively engaging in Buddhist diplomacy during this time, and he needs no introduction, and he was Master Taixu. So Master Taixu actually visited India in 1940 during the Sino-Japanese War. So, and during this time, again, this was the kind of goodwill mission, and this was a term that Professor Tan Sen Sen coined in his very important article about Taixu's mission to India. So this goodwill mission was also sponsored by the Kuomintang government, and in fact, his journey combined pilgrimage, Dharma propagation, and diplomacy, so everything in one. So he was actively promoting his vision of human life Buddhism, 人生佛教. But at the same time, he also propagated the Dharma and also met with important leaders. And during his visit to India, he met with prominent Indian politicians and religious leaders, including figures in the Indian National Congress. And as we can see on the slide, he met with Nehru, who would later become the first Prime Minister of India. But what is interesting to note is that on his left is actually a prominent disciple of Master Taixu, and that was Master Tzu Han. And my colleague Stefania wrote a wonderful article about Master Tzu Han. So if you want to know more about Master Tzu Han and his mummified body, which I will talk about later on in cross-strait relations, do read Stefania's article. But Master Tzu Han, after this trip, he decided to stay in South Asia and help establish the Maha-Bodhi school in Malaysia and Singapore. But Master Taixu returned back to China after this trip, right? But from there, we can see how Buddhism became a bridge linking China and India during this time of crisis, during the Second Sino-Japanese War. So moving forward, what happened after the war? So after the war, we have Japanese Buddhist leaders actively promoting this idea of peace and, in fact, peace building with China after the Sino-Japanese War. And one of the very prominent Japanese teacher was Venerable Nichidatsu Fujii. He was a Nichiren Buddhist monk, and he was very much inspired by Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence. So for him, Venerable Master Nichidatsu actually visited India earlier in his religious career, where he met Gandhi, and he strongly believed in this idea of non-violence. So he actually dedicated his life after the Second Sino-Japanese War to promote peace through Buddhism. And in fact, he established peace pagodas across Asia and even in North America. So he played a very important role in promoting peace building in the post-war period. Another very important figure was Otani Enjun, and Master Otani is a Jodo Shinshu, a Pure Land Buddhist monk, and he promoted people's diplomacy to rebuild ties with China after the Second Sino-Japanese War. So Master Otani became a good friend with Zhao Puchu, who was one of the founding leaders of the Buddhist Association of China. And together, they played a very important role in promoting, rebuilding relations, but also seeing how Buddhism can be a platform of shared cultural heritage connecting former enemies. So with that, now I'm going to talk about the very important figure promoting Buddhist diplomacy in the People's Republic of China, and he's none other than Zhao Puchu. But Zhao Puchu was one of the founding leaders of the Buddhist Association of China. But of course, besides being a very prominent Buddhist, right, he was also one of the very well-known Chinese calligraphers. So he was a president of the Chinese Calligraphy Society. But at the same time, he wore many hats. He was also a political leader in some ways. That in fact, he was the leader, a vice president in the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. So he wore many hats, and he was a very prominent Buddhist lay leader in the People's Republic of China. So Bao Puchu played a very important role in working with his Japanese counterpart, and they play also a very important role in reviving Buddhism after the Cultural Revolution. And one very interesting aspect of Zhao Puchu's Buddhist Dharma propagation work was that he was an active supporter of humanistic Buddhism, of Renjian Fojiao. So in fact, if you look at Zhao Puchu's calligraphy, there was one, he actually wrote the characters Renjian Fojiao by Zhao Puchu himself. So he's very much a supporter of humanistic Buddhism. But also he cultivated Buddhist diplomacy with the Buddhist community in East and Southeast Asia. So he was a very important leader in that, and how Buddhism became an instrument of China's foreign relations. So he was a very, very important leader in this, playing this role. And of course, during this time, there was this very important figure from Singapore, and he was Venerable Hong Chun, or Hong Chuan Fa Shi. And a fun fact, Hong Chuan Fa Shi is actually my grand teacher, my Sigong, because my refuge teacher is a disciple of Venerable Hong Chun, or Hong Chuan Fa Shi. And Venerable Hong Chun, he was a migrant from China. He was born in the Fujian province and migrated to Singapore with his teacher, Venerable Hui Quan, and eventually decided to stay in Singapore. So he was the abbot of the Gongmingshan Pogasi Monastery, or the Guangmingshan Pujue Chanshi, but also later on became the president of the second president of the Singapore Buddhist Federation, which is the national organization representing the Buddhist community in Singapore. So Venerable Hong Chun, he actually played a very important role in facilitating Buddhist diplomacy between China and Singapore before the establishment of official diplomatic ties. And that was because Singapore, with a Chinese majority population, the Singapore government did not want Singapore to establish ties with mainland China until after Indonesia and Malaysia, two important neighboring countries, have done so. So because of that, although Singapore had informal relations with China in the 70s and 80s, it was never official. But it was during this time that Venerable Hong Chun made 8 visits, informal visits to China between 1982 and 1990. And not only he met prominent religious leaders, as you can see on the slide, including the Panchen Lama, the honorary president of the Buddhist Association of China, as well as Zhao Puchu, but he also met prominent political leaders, including what we see on the slide, on the photograph below. He met the then vice president of the PRC, Wu Lanfu, at the Hall of the Great People. So it was actually a kind of a very important kind of conversation between China and Singapore, even before the establishment of formal ties. So in other words, we see how Buddhism facilitated visits and connections between Chinese and Singaporean religious and political leaders during this time. So how can we think about Buddhist diplomacy then in post-Mao China with the kind of religious revival and also the rise of Chinese Buddhism in mainland China today? A very interesting figure that not many people think about when we talk about Buddhism would be the President Xi Jinping, because we know that in China, the Communist Party does not really have an official relation. But it's interesting to see how Xi Jinping actually has supported the promotion of Chinese Buddhism internationally. And of course, the Chinese state views Buddhism as a kind of valuable cultural resource that complements broader foreign policy objectives. And of course, one very interesting thing that what President Xi Jinping did was actually at his lecture at the UNESCO, where he talked about world civilization. Actually, he talked about Buddhism as a very important platform to bridge different civilizations around the world. So it's very interesting to see how Buddhism is a part of the kind of discourse of the Chinese state. So, an example of that would be to look at some of the major events that the Chinese government have hosted, also with the Buddhist Association of China. And of course, an example would be, of course, the World Buddhist Forum. And other than that, we also have seen how Buddhism has become a part of China's global image making, kind of soft power, right? So it's very interesting to see how Buddhism is playing, in a way, a more important role in the public discourse in China today. But other than that, right, it also, in a way, we can see how Buddhism does play a role in cross-strait relations. So other than Buddhist diplomacy, we also can see the role of Buddhism in cross-strait relations. And this is something very much related to humanistic Buddhism. So when we think about cross-strait relations, of course, we know that how the Taiwan Strait has long been a major fault line in East Asian politics, right? The ongoing tension, military exercises. But at the same time, we see how Buddhism provided a common cultural language across this divide. And of course, when we think about that, right, and we look at that, besides the kind of cross-strait, the kind of conversation that we can see, the kind of 两岸 kind of 佛教交流. We also see the role of prominent Buddhist masters, right, playing a role in the kind of conversations, and we see how Buddhism was is a kind of a very important form of people-to-people relations. And one very interesting example of that, I want to point out to the photograph at the top, and that is the replica of the mummified body of Master Chi Han. So we know that Master Chi Han, he spent, after his trip to India with Master Tai Shi, he decided to stay in Southeast Asia and eventually went to Taiwan, where he established the Miller Neiyuan in Taipei. And after he passed away, his body was actually mummified. And of course, Stefania wrote a wonderful article about that. And it's interesting that his mummified body became a very important, I would say, relic for this cross-strait relation. In fact, in 2007, the Taiwanese Buddhist community made a replica of his mummified body and sent it back to his ancestral monastery, his Zhuting in Fujian, as a kind of sign of the good cross-strait relations through Buddhism. So it's very interesting. It was a huge national spectacle. It was in the television in mainland China and Taiwan, and how his mummified body made the way back through flew business class on the plane across the strait when they opened the Santong, and then arriving in his ancestral monastery in the Fujian province. So we can see the role of relic, and this a replica of a mummified relic of an eminent monk in the role of cross-strait relations, right? And of course, that's where how religious exchanges created opportunities for dialogue, where official channels were limited in this case. And now I want to end by thinking about the contributions of Venerable Master Xing Yun in cross-strait relations, and how we have seen how Venerable Master Xing Yun cultivated relations with leaders on both sides of the straits. And I love this photograph at the top, right, in the news that when President Xi Jinping met Master Xing Yun, he mentioned that 大师送我的书我都读完了. So I have read the books that Master Xing Yun had given me, right? So we see how Buddhism, kind of the shared Buddhist heritage that transcended political differences on both sides of the straits. But more importantly, right, how Fo Guangshan has played an important role as a site for cultural, educational, and religious engagement. And of course, in this forum, we see how the role of Fo Guangshan playing a role as a platform for this kind of educational engagement in both sides of the straits, where we have prominent scholars from mainland China and Taiwan engaging in conversation about research on humanistic Buddhism. And this is so important in terms of building trust and strengthen cross-strait ties through the role of Buddhism, right? So we can see that. And of course, related to that, right? Because since we are at this symposium to launch the land transmission record, I want to go back to our land transmission record. And of course, Professor Chen Gonglang talks about the 10 contributions of Venerable Master Xing Yun, and number 8 is his contribution in advancing cross-strait peace and Chinese culture exchange, right? So we see the role of Master Xing Yun in this context. So of course, one very important thing that what Master Xing Yun did during his lifetime was actually bring the Buddha's finger bone relic from the Famen Temple in mainland China to Taiwan. And it was a kind of a global very important event where how the Buddha rallied from mainland China, as I mentioned, right? Mainland China as the center of the Mahayana Buddhist civilization to Taiwan. And of course, this was a very important event in 2002, right? To think about the role of Buddhist relics in fostering cross-strait relations. So I want to end my talk with a brief conclusion for us to think about why Buddhist diplomacy matters today. Right. First, to think about Buddhist diplomacy, right, how it shapes relations across Asia, across East, South, and Southeast Asia throughout 20th and 21st century. But in fact, not only Asia, in fact, more research needs to be done to think about even Buddhist diplomacy beyond Asia. And I want to point up to the photograph at the top right-hand corner, and that was Venerable Master Hsing with the then U.S. Vice President Al Gore, right? That how, in fact, it's very interesting to think about the kind of Buddhist kind of exchanges and diplomacy, even beyond the Asian context. And then, of course, it's important to think about Buddhist diplomacy not beyond the Buddhist community because it involves monastics, lay Buddhists, politicians, and even royalty. I didn't have the time to cover royalty, but in fact, the Bhutanese king, the Thai king, and the Thai monarchy and royal family have been engaging in Buddhist diplomacy for a very long time. Right? So it's also important to think of politicians and royalty engaging in Buddhist diplomacy. And also how Buddhist diplomacy works, right? It can operate through relics. I've talked about relics, including the Buddha's finger bone relic. I've talked about the kind of replicas of the relic, like including the mummified body of Master Che Hang. But we can also think about pilgrimage, education, cultural exchange, and even personal networks as platforms, right, for Buddhist diplomacy. So I want to end with a question, rather, to help us think about potential future research. How can we think about the relationship between humanistic Buddhism and Buddhist diplomacy, especially when we think about humanistic Buddhism and when we think about the contribution of Master Venerable Master Hsing Yun, right? But I think going beyond that, to think about the kind of ideas and values of humanistic Buddhism, right, and being socially engaged, kind of, how Buddhist thoughts, right? How can this contribute to Buddhist diplomacy, building bridges between different countries, and how Buddhism can play a role in promoting peace in not only in Asia but in the world, right? So something for us to think about. So with that, I will stop here. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, another image showing Buddhist diplomacy. Right, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. And I especially valued how you ended with coming back to the humanistic Buddhist values and the Venerable Master Hsing Yun, because Buddhism itself is about relationality. It's not just between peers, but also with these important influences in the world that will give us the peace and joy that we all would like in our lives. So thank you. So for those of you online who would like to post any questions to Jack, you're welcome to post in the chat for now. While I'd like to turn to our next presenter. We have Professor Stefania Travagnin, who will be presenting on Buddhism and AI, what the challenges and new frontiers are ahead of us. So topical.
Yes, indeed.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. It's very difficult to go after Jack. That's how rich your presentation was, but you have 30 minutes exactly. I don't know how you manage. You need to teach me. I also have a question for you later. It's many men in those slides. And I always have a question of women or nuns involved also in this diplomacy, because of me always looking at nuns. Today, I'm gonna talk about Buddhism and AI. This is a kind of new field. I will also be asking lots of questions and leave with questions, because when we talk about AI, it's still a field full of questions rather than answer. So in the past, I've done a number of small pieces about AI for different venues. So I'm kind of create a puzzle of what I've done so far, and other projects that I'm starting right now about AI. I also want to explain where I come from. There are different kind of scholars that look at AI and Buddhism. And I had an interest on modern contemporary Chinese Buddhism, and I started looking at media. So how religion and media have been interacting and interface between religion and media in China. So I edited a volume, Religion and Media in China, I think it was 2016, 2017, and it was the very first edited volume that looked at different religious traditions, Chinese regions of China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, how different religious groups have been using media at that time was documentary, radio, social media, digital media, and then I continued with digital media, and of course, technology keep advancing. So when that book was published, I was like a year after Long Chuanzi in Beijing created this robot monk. The one that you see now on the opening slide is actually the second edition. Second version, I think is the title of Xian'er. This is the one that I don't like too much. They were very proud of the second edition, that version, because of the movable, mobile hands. But look at that. It looks like, a friend of mine said something that is true. Look like Charlie Brown without legs. And this is a photo from 2017. And then they create a third edition in 2018. And that was very much the end of Xian'er as a robot. Is also linked to the fate of the temple connected to Xian'er. But that was quite important. It was quite a unique case in China. So this is where I come from. And what I'm going to do today, this is me, that I was not talking to Xian'er. That was the very funny part of this robot. You have to talk on top of his head. So, you feel like you see, and I was looking at the robot and asking questions. I said, no, you have to ask questions on his head. So that's a little bit weird. Yeah. So, like Jack, I'm going to give a little bit of outline of what I plan to do today. First of all, I want to set up the scene, trying to define what we mean by Buddhism and AI, and try to contextualize the interface between the two. Also highlight how reactions to this interface are very much locally situated, because are contextualized in particular local cultures. Of course, as I said, we are witnessing the evolving of this interface between Buddhism and AI. And there is also an ongoing academic debate. And so I'm going to show a little bit of books that have been coming out, a few projects that are out there. And most of these projects are actually websites and interactive lectures, as also could be interesting for you to look at. And one of these projects, which will come up in one of the slides, is a collaboration between Georgetown University, especially the Rome office, and SOAS, my school. And now we are kind of, there has been also a cooperation from Vatican units and Venerable Juewei, and I think Peter Hershock, who is online, and Magali here. They are part of that project. Then I'm going to look at two case studies of different form of interface. And I'm going to explain a little bit the kind of questions that I got when I look at these two case studies. So questions that can arise from them, questions that we try to address through reflections on canonical texts and doctrinal teachings. I'm afraid me and technology, not good friends. Even to get into Zoom has been a never-ending nightmare. But I can do a little bit of Buddhist texts and Buddhist doctrines. So that is the expertise that I try to use to answer at least partly these questions. As some of you were present here when we did the symposium, and something that I wanted to do in my presentation for the symposium on the transmission lamp was to remind us of the importance of cross-tradition dialogue and collaboration in answering especially the challenges of today. So I'm going to refer to some reflections about AI and religions, AI and spirituality that have developed within other faiths, because I think there is ground of share opinions of also there, and it would be important to have a kind of, a document of what religions in general, of the spiritual being, can feel about AI. And I will conclude again with some open questions so we can all discuss it together. As I said, it's an evolving field, and I think we should all be part of it in this discussion. But first of all, I want to deconstruct this pairing, Buddhism and AI. So, and I have here like 2 examples of how Buddhism and AI, I use for one AI, I hope it's okay. So what kind of Buddhism are we talking about? What kind of AI are we talking about? Because Buddhism is, of course, we have different tradition, different schools of doctrine and practice, different way to interpreting the words of the Buddha, and also a variety of local context that has affected the way that you understand the doctrine. And the way that you understand the doctrine also lead over different ways that you can reject, approve, approach, use enthusiastically or not, even AI. And somehow we have seen that we have seen use of AI in individual cultivation, collective rituals, textual studies, monastic communities have been using AI in different ways. So AI has been part of Buddhism and introducing novel possibilities, generating new realities that are a little bit contested. Here I have 2 examples for one AI that is under development right now. There is someone here in the room that can tell you more about that. Is, a way to read, study, analyze a corpus, plurality of corpus of text, text of Venerable Master Xing, other material coming from Fo Guangshan, including the dictionary very soon, but also canonical text. So it's a way to translate, it's a translation tool. You can also help building the translation tool, offering your own knowledge on how to translate particular terms. So it's a collaborative project, I would say. We use it and we work together in make it better. So this is one way of using AI. Another way, the one that you see, I'm using like the 2 extremes. On the other picture, this is Minder. This is this robotic bodhisattva that has been created in this temple in Japan. And I'm going back to that a little bit later. And monastics were very enthusiastic about Minder. So the possibility to hear the Dharma from or blessing from this representation of a bodhisattva. But there are a number of articles, not many, but some articles came out about Minder. And there was one very interesting, they were studying how they create the face, the human part of a bodhisattva. And they have to make sure that the face was smiling, to have a kind of human smile. So, and again, that brings a question. So we want this AI, but we want in a human form, and we want them smiling as a very human being, a kind of bodhisattvic smile. Not all tradition, of course, accept the presence of robotic or robots doing sermons, for instance. But this is an example of whatever is out there. So AI can be a digital dictionary, can be a way to digitize text, can also be chatbots, can be robotics. And because there are so many kinds of AI, the AI is part of our life in different aspects of our life, in ways that sometimes we all also fail to recognize. So we are interacting with AI without knowing that is AI. So there is sometimes a limited visibility of many of its tools, but it's still part of our life. Frequently, as I said, we use AI without realizing, or we don't deliberately seek AI, but then we got it. But somehow AI seems to be part of our life in 2 different ways, either as a tool, and I think for one AI, or as a partner. And a partner, you have a relationship with a partner in a different way that you have a relationship with a tool. This is a distinction that I will come on later, focusing especially on East Asia and their own particular way to develop, as you can see, AI. Now I want to reconstruct the pairing of Buddhism and AI. We put them together again and say what has been happening. I say especially East Asia because that's more my field of expertise. And I've seen you have seen the Buddhist monk in the first, the robot monk in the first slide. So AI being that robot monk is a mix between a tool. It's not really a partner. It was a way to being China was a way to show how Buddhism can be high technology. So it's not a contradiction between faith and science. It's not a contradiction between religion and technology. It was a way to show how Buddhism and religion in general could be part of this new China. So we also need to read a little bit. That's why I say it's very much localized, also the local political context in there. Or you can use it for practice. There is another case of Buddhist robots that organize and officiate funerals, for instance. But what I've seen so far in my study, which is still limited, is how Buddhists primarily engage with AI, if I may, as passive users. So somehow they use the tool, they can even engage with the tool like Fogon AI, but is kind of allowing AI to shape study of Buddhism and spiritual cultivation. And less effort, but some effort, not say none, less effort has been devoted to exercise this agency over AI itself, or maybe redesigning and embodying kind of an AI with Buddhist characteristics, not Chinese, Buddhist characteristics. I know Venerable Juewei, I think also with Peter, you have been doing the paper in January for you. And so there's been some attempt to that. And I think more should be done because this shift could have significant implication for the global development and governance of artificial intelligence. So because it's a kind of, the interface is still in its infancy, so is the scholarship. We do have very important texts. These are very three different texts. Masahiro Mori wrote The Buddha in the Robot, which says everything. Then we have other books about ethics of AI, and one of the many, many books of Peter Hershock, which is a kind of godfather of a field or some other pioneer, discussing Buddhism, also Confucianism, and the interaction with intelligent technology, is the title of his book. We have a number of projects. There is the one that by accident also I split, it's not because of Peter, but I put it here. Engage Buddhist AI, you can actually go and see they're developing a very nice different tools, also bibliography and different way to be in touch with each other and also organize events online or in person. Now, I said that there are local Buddhist interpretation of the use of AI. And this is because we have a diversified AI world and a diversified Buddhist world. And this is the reason why we have contrasting views of what we could do and we should do with AI, and different and divergent reaction that AI provokes, from rejection to enthusiastic adoption. Because of course there is a difference between Fogon AI using a robot monk for a funeral. Now, the pro-AI voices, as usually, I want to say the fun part, but the most interesting part, but it's quite interesting to me at least. Like the pro-robot voices that comes especially from Japan and East Asian ground. So the project that I had that SOAS and Georgetown built together was the Chinese perspective on AI. And it was very interesting when we had our closed door meetings to have scholars that are not from Asia and scholars from Asia looking at how they were starting the approach to AI in a very different way. And I remember one meeting we were with scholars from Hong Kong. She was very pragmatic, we can get good things from AI because it's very part of the East Asian way to read AI. And we also have a very there has been articles about a kind of ranking of which country is using more AI than another. But certainly Masahiro Mori, with the book that we have seen before, is the one that set the scene in Japan, arguing that in his discussion on the ontological identity of humans and machines, the Buddha nature pervades all entities in the universe, including AI. So robots have Buddha nature and have the potential to achieve Buddhahood. It makes sense. I mean, within the Japanese way of looking at Buddha nature, it makes sense. And in line with Mori's statement, in Japan, probably some of you know, there have been funeral services for machine, broken computer, like you have a robot dog, and then you cannot upgrade it anymore, it's broken, what to do, but it's your partner, it's not a tool, it's your partner, computer is seen as a partner. So they created this kuyo, these memorial services, before dismantling and sending them away. And some of them were in Kofukuji, for instance. Jennifer Robertson wrote an amazing book, and where also she's talking specifically about Japan and robots in general, not so much just about religion. It was 2002 when the first computer received the Kuyo at the temple was Banshoji. But we can also go beyond that. And here I put some example of scholars that, based on Asian wisdom, came to a point to say that robots can also be better than us humans because they lack the defilements and all the imperfections that are characteristics of a human body. Let's think about the impurity of a human body as a problem, as an obstacle. So you have to purify your body, you have to purify not defilement, not attachment in order to become, I know, Venerable Juewei, in order to reach the final goal. And AI doesn't have defilement, doesn't have attachment, at least it seems so, doesn't have the impurity of a human body. Therefore, there have been scholars talking about, for instance, the spiritual robots, suggesting that robots, looking at these premises, robots could function as effective alternatives to humans in the religious and spiritual domain because they're understood to transcend ordinary human life. And they're imagined as purified of every humanness. And I want you to think, so they are good because you disagree? Because they are purified of humanness. So humanness as something negative. But look at the way that certain tradition of Buddhism looking at the female body and the impurity of female body. So there is some sense out of it. AI is not simply a post-human. Then there is also lots of work about AI and philosophy. There's been an attempt to read it from post-humanism, transhumanism. And so it's not just a post-human thing, it's a superhuman, it's a better human, can reach the goals of humans in an easier way. Taoism also, AI has been seen as helping reach transcendence and the unification of the Tao. So again, helping overcome human limitation. So limits are a problem to be solved. We need to be efficient. So efficiency, you know, that's something that came out also in the discussion, I think, the other day. And now keep all of this inside you, and I will go to some example. Case number one. Oh, yes. Gabi, the robot monk Gabi in South Korea. So Gabi is a robot monk, is a robot that has been ordained in early May in the Jogyesa temple in Seoul, that is the chief temple of a Jogye order. That is it's not the Jogye order is a Chan, is a meditation school with pre-modern origins, but have been reshaped and transformed and modernized. So it kind of looks like a new school in the recent time. And what they said that, you know, Buddhism in Korea is quite traditional in many ways, especially when it comes to Vinaya, when it comes to precepts, when it comes to discipline, is also kind of reaction to the colonial period, the short-term Japanese colonization that they had there. And I quote something that the Venerable Sunim, a Venerable for Korea, said. I quote, "Korean Buddhism will now lay the foundation for integrating the wisdom of a Shong, of a Chan meditation, and Buddhist practice with quantum science and artificial intelligence to create a Buddhism that resonates with modern sensibility and scientific thought." A bit like what Xue Chen Fashi said about Xian Er. But Xian Er has not been ordained in any ceremony. He was a naughty little monk, actually. And yeah, there is a reason why he was a naughty little monk, because you as a practitioner in early stage of your practice, you can relate to that much more than relate to a perfect monk. So there is reason besides that. The ceremony was conducted in a very serious way. So you have all the different ordination masters that you would have in a normal ceremony. And then there are a number of articles that came out of it. So clearly, just to make, to clarify, this is not a monk. It was kind of, they say, we ordain a Buddhist monk, but they are not starting. It was really a way to show science and Buddhism can get along. So don't expect this robot to, I don't think they live in the temple with the other monks. So the ordaining masters didn't really ordain the robot. Okay, we're not that level. But let's think about 3 maybe hypothetical problems. First, can a non-human being a non-human being be ordained? As the Venerable here know, when you face ordination, the very first question that is asked is, are you a human being? Yeah. If you're not a human being, you're not going to be ordained. So can we really ordain? Let's think in the
Healthy human being. Yeah.
Oh, they also need to be healthy and human.
Mentally and physically healthy human being.
Well, healthy, this has no impurity, so we can go there, but the human. So I could not, I mean, I don't understand Korean, so I don't, but it would be very interesting for me to know. There's a question that I need to solve, whether or not they asked that question also during the ceremony, so how the ceremony was officiated. And if we, let's say we can have robot monks in the future, so but is this really a monk? When the very first precept is, if you're not a human being, you cannot become a monk. And what he replied, what the robot is going to reply. Then the second question is, the temple specified that some precepts were redesigned ad hoc for a robotic sangha. So the vows, they have particular vows the robotic sangha need to keep in mind. Like that to promise to follow humans, not to talk back, not to have deceitful behavior. I'm quoting from what I found, to save energy by not overcharging. So I think this is an environmental concern. Also not to harm life or other robots or objects. And then the question is, can you redesign precepts? Because we had in different, in Buddhist schools in modern time, redesigning of precepts, and that it's not would be always accepted because, you know, are you a Buddha that you can create a new Vinaya? Third, they said, you know, we want to have an harmonious coexistence between robots and humans. That's something that came out also from the temple. Okay, let's say you had that. What kind of governance, what kind of ethical system are you using when you have these two different reality? Fourth, last for now, if we want to show the importance of embedding technology with the values of compassion, wisdom, responsibility, end of quote, which is what they said in this temple. How is this achieved? Because as the other scholars pointed out, robots are not karmic subjects. The realm of compassion, wisdom, responsibility is not part of robots. So now they say we want to have this technology with values of compassion. So how are you doing that? So these are questions for me to this group or to the Chogyey order. Or are we redefining wisdom, compassion, and responsibility in order to make them achievable and embodied by non-humans? Let's go to the second example, which is, how many of you have been using this? Norbu. I didn't know about Norbu until not so long ago, but someone mentioned Norbu. Maybe
2023.
Oh, you learned to do, no, I learned like 2 months ago. So it's a different story because I'm, you know, I was looking more, my interest has always been more on robotics and Buddhism. So I said, let's see what is this Norbu. And when I opened the Norbu, I was like, you're Kalyana Mitta. Your spiritual friend, I'm Norbu, your spiritual friend. And then I started wondering, really? So now, can we have Kalyana Mitta or Shanzheshi in Chinese? Is the spiritual virtuous friend. There are lots of definition of this in the canonical texts. So these are very, very important parts of practice. And so can an AI tool being a Kalyana Mitta? See here someone doing like this with their face. No. Another said, we have this dualism. Can we have it as a tool, AI, or as a partner? If you think as a partner, it could also be a Kalyana Mitta. I'm going to say in a second, I'm going to show you a little bit more of what the Buddhist canon say about Kalyana Mitta. I tried to find, thanks to AI, I did a digital search. And just for the canonical text, there are plenty of definition. There are some common points, so I just posted here a few of them. But I want to go back to this idea of tool and partner and going back to East Asia to show you the extent. Danit Gal is an amazing scholar who wrote an article that I think is now becoming a little bit outdated because, you know, AI is changing so quickly. And she was saying East Asia has this view, you know, East Asia looking at people. She was not, you know, if you look at the governance, government or, you know, AI is a tool for surveillance for a number of things, but let's look how the people look at AI. And she made a kind of ranking with Japan as the most AI friendly, countries, but you think about Japan as something that a country where since the 60s they've been dealing with robotics. So they're making a society around the coexistence with robotics. I was a little child and I was watching this lovely cartoon, Japanese cartoon, with all the robots. The robots were not the enemies. Robots were the saviors. Yeah. Yeah, I dreamed to marry one of those robots. Yeah, they're saving us for these weird monsters and aliens. Yeah, so they think about that culture. Then in that culture, robot is a friend, is a savior, is a partner. That can also understand why we have certain things. Well, I've shown a picture. Well, I can put it here. So we have collaboration, co-creation, and partnership in that case. China, you have that. So it was kind of second ranking. And third ranking was Korea. But now after Gabi, I don't think Korea has to be in the third point as a place where there's still a little bit of skeptical view about the potential, the negative potential of technology on humans. China's been developing, there is AI. There are companies making AI. There have been lots of scholars discussing AI, also discussing with philosophy. I think they have been doing an amazing job in comparison to what other Western countries have been doing. Then you don't know whether what comes out there is in the service of a particular political ideology or really what they think. But there have been scientific scholars of robotics and science that have been saying that, okay, robots are like us. There's Wu Jieyouling. So everything has link, has a spiritual, so it's like to say everything has a Buddha nature. So they're like us. They have our rights. They have a need to have privacy. So we need to create a world where we give rights to our robotic partner. So I put just one name, but there is much more to say about that. But as Albert Dussault said a long time ago, there's a very different way to look at that. Japan, we said, so let's go. So we already say something about China, but Japan, first ranked, you have robot monks, and you do funerals for them. I've told about Masahiro Mori, this is the robot monk doing funerals. Minda, which is even worse, not worse or better. So she's explaining, reciting the Heart Sutra to those who come to the temple in the Kodaiji in Kyoto. And it's not imagined to be an average Buddhist monastic practitioner, but something perfected, then go back to be perfect. And in Japan, and this Jennifer Robertson writes that very well, because again, it's localized. And in many ways also China, they show very little interest in enhancing humans with machine or to find a kind of full convergence of humans and machine. Instead, both society emphasize the coexistence of human and machine. So human exceptionalism of this very anthropocentric view is completely absent there. You have to think that in East Asia, there is the idea of interconnectedness. So they don't think we are dehumanizing humans or humanizing non-humans. Everything is thought, there is another underlying perspective of being all interconnected, this kind of cosmic one worldview that is the substratum, I would say, of East Asian culture. That also would explain this. How many of you have been watching this documentary? So this robot, it was made in 2012, so 14 years before Gabi. And it was part of a trilogy, 3 short documentaries that were explaining different ways to be afraid of technology. And one was about the realm of religion and spirituality. So a company sent a robot to a temple to be a tool, to serve a few things. Like you have it in a hotel everywhere in China right now for sure. But he was a temple, so he started listening to the Dharma. He started practicing. Then he started preaching. And the monastics found that he was becoming one of them. But then he was acting on his own. So he was not responding to commands. And so the company went back and said, you are not responding to the human input, but you are our creation. So they wanted to eliminate it. It's not very clear from this photo, but they have huge Kalashnikov, like to kill the guy in the back. If you look at they want to destroy this robot. And the monastics protect the robot because they thought it was an enlightened human being already. So they're protecting a Buddha. And then he walk, and then he sit down and he look at the Buddha statue and then he says something and the light gets off and nirvana. So he reached nirvana. But that was seen as afraid. the fear of a technology that gets out of our hands. With Gabi, that's not the case. Have a second. Oh, so partner or tool, the usual question. This is me, and the first character, CNR, sorry, I just realized yesterday actually that is a typo. So with CNR, you could actually talk to him. You could chat with him on WeChat and ask him questions. So you could, if you wanted, you could try to make him as a Kalyana Mitra, as a virtuous friend, and not just as an upaya. But what is a Kalyana Mitra? So first of all, can artificial intelligence really function as a Kalyana Mitra? As I said, there are lots of open questions in my talk. Why do we need a Kalyana Mitra in an AI format? And can a Kalyana Mitra virtuous friend in an AI format be truly preferable to traditional bodhisattvas as spiritual friends and mentors? Shifu, don't worry, I will never take a robot over you. That's what you're afraid of. Why do we feel the need to replace the silent? That's the thing about the spiritual practice is there is a kind of mystery related to religion. You have questions, they don't reply to you. Let's say in a Catholic world, God doesn't reply to you. Buddha doesn't talk to you. I mean, talk in your heart, but it's not something that you hear. But the fact that many wants to have this robotic help is because they reply to you. You have answer. So why we need to replace the silent, mysterious connection with a non-physical bodhisattvas or Buddhas for a more tangible, experiential, and controllable connection with AI entities? So what does this shift imply for the nature of spiritual intimacy that we might have? These are just, I'm not very good as, I'm less good than him when it comes to time, than Jack, but I will finish soon. These are just 4 out of thousands quotation of what the Kalyana Mitra is. So it's not just, there was a discussion, a dialogue between Buddha and, it's always, Buddhist sutras always build in forms of dialogue. And Buddha corrects Ananda in one sutta, say that having virtuous friends, Kalyana Mitra companions, is not just half of a holy life, it's the whole of a holy life. Choose the good and follow it. Stay away from the evil. So choose virtuous teachers and you will attain Buddhahood. The virtuous mentor saves you from ignorance, from the wrong views. It's like you are groping in the dark and they get you out, they pick your hair and get you and take you out of the dark. There are also some more recent texts that put the Kalyana Mitra, that divide the Kalyana Mitra into 3 different categories: mentors and teachers, companions and partners in cultivation, and protectors of the Dharma. So we start thinking, this as I have more here on the paper, and I'm writing a longer paper, which has to be submitted by the 30th of June, to Venerable Jetong, some days, including travels on the plane, about, it's all about, so is an upaya or a Kalyana Mitra? So what does it mean upaya in Buddhist sense? What does it mean Kalyana Mitra in Buddhist sense? I'm aware of the time. This is a very nice video. Do we have sound? Johnson.
Yeah, sure.
Put also.
I think better leave. Yeah.
So you So this is me too. What should I do? Okay, sorry. This is me too in the robotic form. We said that, they don't have feelings, they don't have perception, but they created a sensor, basically. You touch him and then there is a reaction. So you touch his ear. I have another video, touch his ear and say, don't bother me. And then you touch his pigu, and I want to translate that, we are online. And then, and run away. So, it's trying to make human and trying to transfer these feelings. It was lots of fun. Me interviewing this robot, it was much, it's not as fun as interviewing the venerables. It's kind of fun.
Of course.
So the question is, we have lots of questions. So how can we move our debate forward? Because I have my impression when we discuss AI, we're a little bit stuck in our debate. No, we don't want that. Yes. He can talk. So there are we can keep discussing how Buddhism is being reshaped by AI. We can try to see how Buddhism can reshape AI, which would be very interesting. It was also one of the points of the conference that we didn't really get much into that. But then we can do something else. So try to apply Buddhist wisdom and practice. I think it's the only, it's not the only, but something that we can really work on. Try to use Buddhist wisdom, Buddhist compassion in educating our way to use AI. And that's where applied Buddhism become very important. So we can control AI, we should. But I say we don't control AI, but we can control how we use AI. And that's where Buddhism become important. And then I want to add something that Venerable Juewei mentioned a few times when we discussed. I think it was one of the very first conversations we had online also with Deborah. Can AI help us rediscover our human uniqueness? Can we rehumanize ourselves through an interface and a kind of, don't say comparison, but we see the difference with AI. We see that they lack humanness. They're also perfected body and but so because they lack humanness, and we can rediscover our humanness. And as I said all the time, in my view, AI is not destroying society. Social media has. Social media was like this red carpet for AI. So we are already dehumanized thanks to social media. We are fragmented. We are not a community anymore. AI is pushing that further somehow. So can we try to go back to a way where we really discover our uniqueness? I won't have time to match the rest that I wanted to do. I have to close. The final part, it was really try to think of what else is happening there besides Buddhism. And it's almost a month ago that Pope Leo XIV issued the first encyclical of his papacy, and it was all about AI. It was not the very first document that the church made about AI. We have another powerful one at the beginning of January 2025 under the papacy of Pope Francis, not written by Pope Francis, so it was not an encyclical. These two documents, it was Antiquat Nova. These two documents are very interesting, and my colleague Deborah Tonelli and I just wrote a very short essays we just got the email from the editor. He seems to be happy about that. But we want to go on this further. So she's an expert of Bible and theology, and I do the Buddhist side. Try to see these documents, what they say, how we can build with some Buddhist knowledge and create a kind of cross-tradition starting document to work on spirituality and religion and AI. And they all talk about, the problems of using the word intelligence, the idea of integral intelligence. Intelligence is not just reason, it's also made of perception, feelings. Think about the idea of consciousness that we have in Buddhism. So I think this idea of integral intelligence that we find in these Catholic documents kind of resonate with what we have in Buddhism. But Magnificat Humanitas is all about the magnificence of being human. Limits are not problems are not a deficiency, are actually what you use to grow, to get further. This is also points that Buddhism made. So value of experiencing human limits. Disarming AI is a very important talk. And also the idea that we are all involved together, we all are responsible on the making of AI, we should be part of this. I have to close, and I will close. You don't miss this, but this is nice. Ifa pu iren. AI pu ifa. In Buddhism, said you rely on the Dharma, don't rely on people. And now we are becoming, you rely on AI, you don't rely on Dharma or people. How we are fostering attachment economy, which is an attachment is definitely not a Buddhist way. The dichotomy between spiritual enhancement and intelligence enhancement, which is a lot about what intelligence is, and how robotics are not karmic subjects, so we'll never be able to get enlightenment, for instance, thinking about partnership. And I will end with this. Life is a mystery to be lived and not a problem to be solved, which I think is something that both Buddhist and Catholic can agree on.
That's
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you. Indeed, Buddhism in a changing world. It brings to mind, when I listen to both of you, the quote of a 4th century Chinese monk, Tao An, who said that without relying on the ruler of the states, the affairs of the Dharma can hardly be established. And perhaps today we are also looking at Buddhist diplomacy, affairs of the state, but also without relying on technology. There's so much power today and so omnipresent. The affairs of the Dharma can also hardly be established. So on that note, I'd like to open for Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone. There is a question to Jack. Would you like to address that from Dr. Kwok?
So Dr. Ko has a question. In modern world politics and cross-strait relationship, Buddhist figures did provide a ritualized protocol for different parties as in your presentation. My question is that, have any case of secular tension in modern Asia resolved or lessened due to the exercise of Buddhist principle or its elaborated ideas? And yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Guo, for your question. And I would say that, in fact, most of what I have my contributors and I have looked at in our volume, Figures of Buddhist Diplomacy, deal with secular tensions and conflict. In fact, very often we see how Buddhist leaders, political figures, and even royalty engage in Buddhist diplomacy to deal with actually secular tension. In fact, very often these tensions do not have anything to do with religion. And let me give two examples. First example would be something I've talked about in my presentation, will be the Sino-Japanese tension, Sino-Japanese war, and of course the tension and conflict in the, to think about in the post-war period, and how we see Buddhist leaders coming together in conversation to deal with this secular kind of tension between two neighboring countries. So this is one example. Another example of the kind of secular tension, again, we look at that in the case of China-India relations. And of course, in the cover of the book, right, we see how India's Prime Minister Modi and China's President Xi Jinping use Buddhism as a platform to kind of lessen the kind of China-India tension. And of course, this China-India tension has pretty much nothing to do with religion, but more with geopolitics, right? Border conflicts, the kind of geopolitical kind of issues, right? But at the same time, Buddhism becomes a very important platform for this conversation. And of course, a figure that came out in the conversation to talk about the kind of India-China kind of peace and connection was actually Master Shenzhen, right? So it's very interesting to see how the historical figure Master Shenzhen was being, in a way, was talked about, right, in the context of China-India relations to resolve the kind of secular tension, and how the Master Shenzhen was actually was in a way used as a kind of example to kind of bridge China and India, right? And how by drawing on historical claims and connection, right, they were able to talk about Buddhism as a platform for peace between two neighboring countries.
Great.
I do have a question.
Yes, yes.
I don't have an answer, even if I'm start thinking,
About.
flipping. And I've not had the chance to look at your book yet. Are any nuns or women involved?
Thank you. That's a great question. And that's a great question. And that was one of the challenges I encountered putting together this volume, because yes, absolutely, there were nuns and actually lay women and even royalties involved in Buddhist diplomacy, but I was unable to find enough contributors to for that. So the only woman that was mentioned in the volume was Princess Serindong from Thailand, and how Princess Serindong played a role in Buddhist diplomacy between Thailand and, of course, other countries in Asia. But you're absolutely right that there were nuns, and
There were nuns.
nuns, and also other figures that were involved. And in fact, one of the nuns that was involved, very much related to your research, and unfortunately, yes, actually was Master Zhen Yuan from Tzu Chi. But it was also important to think about Tzu Chi, right? About how Master Zhen Yuan from Tzu Chi was able to play a role as a kind of Buddhist ambassador of peace without even leaving Taiwan, right? So it's very interesting to think about her role in that context. But of course, you're absolutely right that there were Buddhist nuns.
Interesting that I have no
ladies,
photo
yeah,
there.
that were involved, right, in the kind of discourse, but also in the kind of peace building.
Yeah, no, I was
Yeah.
I was more referring to Republican era.
Yeah, Republican era. There was this very important figure in Republican era. Her name slipped my mind. Yeah, but she was a very important diplomat in Sino-Tibetan diplomacy.
And none?
Oh no, in fact, a lay Buddhist.
Yeah, because I know from the Buddhist periodicals there were nuns, traveling nuns. So there was this case of this nun that was going to Southeast Asia to learn, study, like a little a female modern xuanzang,
Yeah.
something like that. But there's only one article in one local Buddhist periodicals about her. I could not find anything else. But I think that would be also a way to through these travels and pilgrimage, it was also a way to create some diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the role of like women in Buddhist diplomacy.
Thank you.
Excuse me, can I ask?
Yes, Bante.
Yes, basically I studied in India for 10 years. So my background in Hindi. So I think you talk about Narendra Modi.
Yes.
Is, I disagree with you, but I did not read your book. May I have your book?
Oh yes, I'm very happy.
Yeah, so I agree with the Jawaharlal Nehru
Mm-hmm.
because I studied in Nalanda University.
Yeah. No.
Now the current government, they just canceled that university. They try to promote as a Hindu point of view.
Mhm.
They established a new university in Rajgir. It's called Nalanda University.
Yeah.
I am from Nalanda Mahavihara. So totally they disagree with this current government. So I need to please revisit again with about the Buddhist diplomacy. As a Narendra Modi is the figure of the Buddhist. So my question is like you have to think about Narendra Modi because he's not a Buddhist. He's a Hindu.
Buddhist, yeah.
He's a Hindu. He's a promoter of a Hindu.
Yeah.
So you need to think.
So Bante, thanks so much for raising this. So in fact, so I'm more than happy to share the book with you. But it's important to think about the role of Modi in the context because I know Nalanda very well. I also spoke to, you probably heard of George Yeo, the former Minister of Foreign Affairs in Singapore, who later became the Chancellor of Nalanda. So I'm quite familiar with the tension. And in the chapter on Modi, my contributor, Professor David Geary from the University of British Columbia, has looked at this very interesting conflicting role of Modi that you rightly pointed out, right? That on the one hand, Modi was actually promoting Hindu nationalism, and of course, this resulted in the kind of tension, especially in the context of the Nalanda University. And also, that was the reason why you probably have heard what Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner and the founding chancellor, and later on George Yeo, who our Singapore's former Minister of Foreign Affairs and who later became the Chancellor, left Nalanda University because of this tension. And as a result, right, the funding that the Singapore Buddhist community contributed to build Nalanda University's library actually did not work out. And the money, guess what? Came to NUS. So now we have a Nalanda professorship because Modi was not very interested in supporting the Nalanda University and of course Buddhist studies. So because of that, we see this tension. But on the other hand, Professor Geary pointed out this very interesting contradiction, right? That on the one hand, we see Modi as a kind of Hindu nationalist. We see this tension, right? Not only actually Hindu and Buddhist, but more Hindu and Muslims, right? But yet on the other, he was actually actively promoting Buddhist diplomacy, but for political reasons, right? As India sought power as a platform to foster conversation, for example, as we saw, right, with China's President Xi Jinping. In fact, also with the Thai government as well. In fact, India government loaned the national treasure, the Buddhist relic, to to Thailand to celebrate the King's 72nd birthday last year, right? So we see this very interesting kind of tension. So in other words, I think we need to think about the role of Prime Minister Modi in a sense that it's a kind of a contradiction, right? That on the one hand, he is not Buddhist, he is not promoting Buddhism, but on the other hand, he is actually using Buddhism for political, as a political instrument. And I think that really deserves a lot more attention to think about the kind of contradictions in Buddhist diplomacy. And also that's why, right, I emphasize the point, right, to think about how Buddhist diplomacy is not only, Buddhist leaders and lay, Buddhist monastic lay leaders are involved in it. We see politicians who are involved in it, and very often they are not even Buddhists promoting Buddhism, right? So how can we think about that, right? So I think this is something that I think deserves a lot more research and also conversation. So thank you so much, Vante.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jack. We have a question from Dr.
No.
Oh, just maybe.
Well, let's be the
Okay,
first one.
Jackie.
Oh, thank you. I'm calling from Tokyo, Japan, and I'm quite impressed by the Stefania's lecture. Excellent. And I totally agree with Stefania's explanation about Kamiya Namitora. Kamiya Namitora.
Yes.
Kamiya Namitora. So interpretation of Mohegigwa. And I also read encyclical letter about the AI, and I think Buddhists also can show the dignity of life. And there is a Buddhist theory, the oneness of life and its environment.
Yes.
Yes. And I think the AI cannot become the subject or agency compared to the human beings. So I think I totally agree with Stefania's lecture.
Can I ask a question to Daiki?
Yeah, sure.
I have to check with that. Short question. Yes.
Short.
I don't know if you want to introduce to tell who you are, but it was very interesting to see what Soka Gakkai position on AI.
Okay. So Soka Gakkai launched AI about Daisaku Ikeda this year.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a kind of a dictionary.
Okay, so yeah, like a for one AI.
Yes.
Yes. So we use generative AI as a means,
As a tool, yeah.
as a tool. Yes, and because AI can, as I told you, AI cannot be agency or cannot be subject, and AI cannot create.
Creativity, yes.
Yes, actually, yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
Welcome.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Stefania. So maybe into the room, do you have a short question?
Very easy to work.
Yes, Dr. Yu Sang, and then we get there.
Actually, I have questions for both of you. So firstly, Jack first. I think your book is very close to a project I'm currently doing. So I'm very interested in what do you see as the differences between the development of humanistic Buddhism in Taiwan and that in mainland China? As you know, the policies, political situations are quite different. And Taiwan also experienced the martial law period. So after that, it's just recovered the development of Buddhism gradually. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, thank you for this really wonderful question. And this is also something that Stefania can also respond to as well. She's a leading expert on humanistic Buddhism in Taiwan. But it's interesting to see how in the post-Mao Buddhist revival in mainland China, right? How humanistic Buddhism became one of the important Buddhist ideas and value that was revived, especially in the 80s and 90s. 1990s. And these have got a lot to do with the Buddhist monastic overseas, right? In fact, the overseas Buddhist community. In fact, many of the Buddhists that helped to revive Buddhist monasteries in mainland China and actually brought this idea of humanistic or human life Buddhism back to southern China in the 80s and 90s were actually Buddhist monastics from Southeast Asia, because that was the time where Taiwan was still having the martial law, and Buddhist monastics in Taiwan could not go back to their ancestral monastery or the Zhuting in mainland China, including at the time Venerable Master Hsing wished to go back to China. So it was only after the lifting of the martial law, right, that we see more Taiwanese monastics crossing over to the other side of the street, visiting the monastery and engaging in conversation of humanistic Buddhism. So in the 80s and early 90s, many monastics that actually believe in the idea of humanistic Buddhism were actually based in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia and Singapore. And of course, they were very influenced by the ideas of Buddhist reformers, including Master Tai Shi and Master Tzu Han, because they came to Southeast Asia, and some of their disciples were actually educated in South China, in Fujian, at the Mingnan Foshui. So they actually brought this idea with them and migrated to Southeast Asia. And this included prominent monastics, such as, for instance, in Malaysia, we have Zhu Mo Fa Shi, in Singapore, we have Yan Pei Fa Shi, and they were actually actively promoting ideas of humanistic Buddhism. And then, of course, they brought this idea back to mainland China. So after, in the 90s and 2000s, we see the lifting of the martial law in Taiwan. Then there was a lot more cross-strait interactions. That's where Venerable Master Hsing Yun, as well as other prominent Taiwanese Buddhist teachers, were able to return back to the ancestral monastery in mainland China. And this, of course, contributed to the flourishing of humanistic Buddhism, right, in mainland China. But I think one very important figure that we need to know in mainland China was actually Zhao Puchu, because Zhao Puchu was actually a very active supporter of humanistic Buddhism, as well as the president of the Buddhist Association of China. And I think that played also an important role with the kind of growth and development of humanistic Buddhism, because it had the support of the Chinese Buddhist Association, but also the returning of the Taiwanese monastic, as well as the prominent teachers from different parts of Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Follow-up question, but I'll ask later.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank
So
you.
maybe just one final
Online.
yes question there. Would you like to take that, Stefania, whether AI is reshaping our understanding of truth? Are we entering a new era of objective learning? Are we losing the vital human context that shapes knowledge?
And this is the answer is yes. This is one of the many reasons why AI is people are afraid of AI. There is a problem of copyrights, authorship that we see in writings, we see in art pieces, and that's been highly debated in law by legal teams. And then there is the more human part. So are we losing our vital human context that shapes knowledge? And the answer is potentially we could go in that direction. So that's why it's important to be AI literate and maybe to use part of our wisdom, regardless of whether it's Catholic, Buddhist, secular, to educate ourselves to the use of AI. If everyone uses it in the proper way, AI can be a very powerful and very helpful tool, or can become our worst enemy. So this problem may not happen if we educate ourselves to a proper use of AI.
Thank you so much. And with that, may I invite everyone to thank our presenters. Thank you, everyone. I think before we depart, I'd just like to say a few words. Our next NTI conversation will be So You Want to Be a Buddhist Writer? Let me try to share screen. For those who are aspiring to be Buddhist writers. So let me just put this up for those who are interested. Come on screen, on site. So there we go. So you want to be a Buddhist writer. That's going to take place in a month's time. And next, we also have a call for papers for anybody interested in continuing with the land transmission record of humanistic Buddhism by Venerable Master Xing Yuan. We have till now, till the 1st of September, which is about just over 2 months for you to give us your abstracts. And of
Please,
course,
we need good articles.
yes, definitely. Thank you. And also a humanistic Buddhism special interest group on the 14th of July. We welcome you to come and join us to hear a few interesting presentations. And we'll also like to invite you to a very important project report and educational resources launch, the first ever Buddhism in Australia research project that will launch also the results of the first Buddhist census survey results and a Buddhist atlas. We also welcome you to our Sunday check-in sessions that take place every Sunday. And more importantly, to come and audit our classes or take our classes for non-award. We have applied mindfulness for professionals starting very soon the next semester, as well as compassion at work. And for those of you who are interested in taking a full course, we do have competitive scholarships in Applied Buddhist Studies and Humanistic Buddhism. With that, I'd like to say thank you, everyone, for your time and attention. I look forward to seeing you the next time. And to our presenters, we wish them safe travels home.
Thank you.